Cambridge, Massachusetts is the mecca for institutions of higher learning in the United States, boasting over 60 colleges and universities. The city was also an integral piece in the creation of the public school system in America. Beyond its rich history and educational prowess, there's also a side of the city that most civic leaders and university chancellors don't want the public to see. Let's discuss some of the notorious neighborhoods and underworld legends of America's university city. What's up, everyone? Welcome back. Today I have an awesome video for you guys, one that I've wanted to make for quite some time. Seeing how all of you have been enjoying these types of videos with the success of the Charlestown and Worcester ones, I figured there's no better time than the present. Not only does Cambridge have some of the richest history in the Bay State, which all my regular viewers know is truly my heart, but it's also a very interesting city that honestly is quite different than most people's perception of the place. Yes, Cambridge is America's university city and has been basically since its inception, even getting its name from England's famous university town, but there's so much more to this place than just institutions for higher learning. Like everywhere else in the Boston metro area and really the entire eastern part of Massachusetts, gentrification is running full throttle in Cambridge, rapidly changing the landscape and the physical appearance of the city. Still, even to this day, Cambridge has some of the most public housing projects in a single municipality in the commonwealth of Massachusetts. But back in the 20th century, Cambridge had a large, bustling, blue-collar, working-class community that was just as tough and proud as any other place in the Boston area. I'm truly hoping people will give this a chance like they have my other videos made in this style. I have hesitated in the past, while there's always a little bit of clowning in my comment section. For some reason, people in the Boston area especially like to clown on the streets of Cambridge. Because of its incredibly close proximity to Boston, Cambridge is constantly being compared to the much larger city. While Cambridge is a big city, it's not Boston, and like anywhere else in Massachusetts, you can't really compare anywhere to the Bean. With gentrification rapidly changing the city and leaders focused on projecting the image of a nice place to attract college students, Cambridge is becoming an increasingly safe city. But just a few years back, violence was erupting on the streets in one of the city's worst gang feuds between Cambridge's Port 44 and Somerville's MP 45, who have been bitter enemies for quite some time. But the street lore of Cambridge is much deeper than this particular beef, and the demographics of the city's underworld include more than just African American or Haitian gangs or Latino traffickers that the media focuses on. One neighborhood in Cambridge actually mirrored the same criminal elements that prevailed in Charlestown, Southie, and Winter Hill and Somerville, but you just don't hear about it as much. If you compare Cambridge statistically crime-wise to other Massachusetts cities of its size like Lynn or Brockton, Cambridge is a very safe city, but just go back 5 or 6 years and there was a dramatic spike in violent crime in the city, so it's not like that stuff doesn't happen here. And the violence is almost always targeted, not random, with different members of opposing street organizations aiming for each other. But before we get into all that, keeping with our tradition on this channel, let's discuss the history of Cambridge first. And let me tell you what an amazing history the city has. Not only does Cambridge have some of the richest history in the Bay State, a place rife with this stuff, but has some of the most incredible history in the entire United States. I myself, of course, am a history buff and pride myself in knowing most of Massachusetts history, but I learned an incredible amount while researching for this video. Not only is Cambridge the center for higher learning in America, but the model for it was created here as well. Not only that, but the idea for a public school system and the country's first grammar school also began in Cambridge. The city is a reason for America becoming a mostly literate society and helped shape us into a world power. Cambridge was also instrumental in the earliest phases of the American experiment. In 1630, Puritans arrived at what they called the Shawmut Peninsula, now known as Boston. John Winthrop, who would be the Massachusetts Bay Colony's first governor, found this place suitable, but a small group of Puritans led by Thomas Dudley, who would be the first deputy governor, decided to travel further up what eventually would be called the Charles River. He and some of the settlers thought the Shawmut Peninsula was too vulnerable, sticking out at the mouth of the rivers. Pirates could come and harass them. Even back then, over 100 years before the Revolutionary War, he also mentioned that it would be too hard for large British warships to navigate further up this difficult river as well. 1630, they discovered what was originally referred to as Newtown on the western bank of the Charles River. Thomas Hooker would be the town's first minister. He traveled across from England aboard the same ship as legendary figures like John Harvard and John Cotton. The early settlers wanted to build a palisade or a fort to protect them from the natives who had lived in the area for thousands of years. Not being able to afford this, the leaders of Cambridge, or Newtown, tried to levy a tax on the residents of the neighboring Watertown. Their neighbors rejected this request, saying they feared bringing themselves into financial bondage, basically laying the groundwork for the communities to reject being taxed by outside forces. It set a huge precedent for the things to come. Thomas Hooker would eventually butt heads with other leaders like John Winthrop and Cotton, who were more focused on creating the framework of the Royal Charter to start a new government in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, primarily in Boston. While originally the capital was going to be based in Charlestown in 1630, it was moved to Boston and stayed there until 1634. Newtown was actually the capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for 2 years, but in 1638 it moved back to Boston and remains there to this very day. Hooker ended up leading a congregation to settle in the Connecticut River Valley, creating the colony of Connecticut. They settled in Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield. Hooker was an incredibly intelligent man who would go on to create the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was the first constitution ever written in history and would go on to be the model for the American Constitution. That's why Connecticut is called the Constitution State. Hey. Thomas Shepard had married Hooker's daughter, almost left with him, but ended up staying and became the next minister of Newtown. The settlement and the colony as a whole had a problem, though. Only about 1 in every 200 people were literate. Really, the only people who could read and write and went to college were ministers. So, in response, Puritan leaders decided they need to build a college in the colony. Because of the confidence that they had in Shepard, they decided to build it in Newtown. The idea was to teach new people to read and write before the few that did passed on and there was no literate people left in the colony. In 1636, the Massachusetts Bay General Court ruled to give £400 to create the college in Newtown. In 1638, a single frame wooden house opened as the school with a college yard attached. In 1638, John Harvard passed away and donated over 400 books from his personal library to the college and also half of his property. It was in turn named Harvard College. The leaders of the town decided to change the name of the settlement to reflect its new position in the colony. They changed the name of the settlement from Newtown to Cambridge after the legendary university town in England. In 1642, the first class of 9 students graduated from Harvard, beginning America's journey into higher learning. The college actually owned a large farm in Billerica, Mass. Until 1775 that helped pay for many of the school's needs. In 1764, a huge fire happened, destroying over 5,000 books, including all but one of John Harvard's original collection. I wonder how much that one book is worth now. By 1640, the Great Puritan Migration had pretty much ended, but by now word had spread, and English settlers were arriving in the Massachusetts Bay Colony by the thousands. The leaders of Harvard saw the need to have some sort of preparatory school for the students before they went to college. These college prep schools became the basis for grammar schools in the United States and were really the very beginning of the public school system in America. In 1642, the Massachusetts Bay Colony General Court ruled that you had to educate your children or be fined. In 1648, a Latin school was built and supported by parents' tuition fees until 1660 when the town bought it for public education, but fees continued well into the 1700s. In the early 1800s, the English high school was also built. A school called the Manufacturing Training School of Cambridge was built in 1888 and would later become the Rindge Technical School. In 1653, the first Native American graduated from Harvard, and a man named John Eliot, an early apostle to the natives, used a printing press in Cambridge to translate the entire King James Bible into the native language, the first person to do so. In 1780, Harvard became a university and introduced its medical school in 1782. Cambridge itself began to expand during this time period as well. The West Boston Bridge was constructed in 1793, connecting Cambridge directly with the bustling city of Boston. This allowed goods and people to flow much freer than they did in the past, and the city's population exploded. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out another major moment in American history that took place in Cambridge. In 1775, about a month after the Battle of Bunker Hill and being appointed the leader of the Continental Army by the colony's Congress, George Washington first took control of his army and laid eyes on them when they were camped out at the Cambridge Commons on July 3, 1775. This is really where the Revolutionary War began in earnest. Bunker Hill was a battle, but with Washington's leadership and French help, they turned the militia into an army that defeated the world's greatest empire at the time. By appointing Washington general, a man from Virginia, they were connecting the southern colonies to this northern conflict. The population began to grow in the late 1700s and early 1800s in Cambridge. The area around Cambridge Common and Harvard College, where the original fort had been built, became known as Old Cambridge, and this was the most densely populated part of the town. Eventually, Old Cambridge would join with Cambridge Port, East Cambridge, and North Cambridge to become the city of Cambridge in 1846. Many of the first immigrants to come to Cambridge were English, Germans, Scots, people from Labrador and Nova Scotia, but by the mid-1800s, many Irish fled the city as well. Many of the city's first industries that attracted these early immigrants were manufacturers of soap, rubber, musical instruments, but the confectionery industry was one of the city's most successful. By the 1920s, there was over 25 factories in the city manufacturing candy or some type of confectionery product. By the late 1800s, most of the commerce had shifted from Harvest Square to Central Square. By the early 1900s, many of these new immigrants had taken on the civic roles once held by the descendants of the Puritan settlers. By the turn of the 20th century, many new immigrant groups entered the city. In 1890, Swedish people came. Around 1895, huge numbers of Portuguese came, mostly from the Azores, along with refugees from the Russian Empire like Latvians, Lithuanians, Jewish people, along with many ethnic Polish people. Around 1900, large amounts of my Greek brethren came to Cambridge, along with Syrians and Armenians. People from this region were the last great wave of quote unquote European immigrants. Cambridge is directly across the Charles River from Boston neighborhoods like the West End and the North End, which were notorious as the first stop for newly arrived immigrants, possibly not from places deemed as desirable by the ruling Brahmin class of Boston. These neighborhoods were infamous with tenements, overcrowding, and poor living conditions, so a lot of this was brought over to the neighboring city of Cambridge neighborhoods like Cambridge Port and East Cambridge, which sat right across the river, becoming very similar to neighborhoods like the West End. Besides this bustling new European immigrant population, the city of Cambridge also has a long and storied black population as well. The first black residents of the city date all the way back to the 1600s. The first black neighborhoods in Cambridge were in the Lower Port neighborhood, also up near Porter Square, in the Walden, Mead Street, and Richdale Avenue area. After the Civil War, the black population of the city tripled and grew to over 1,500 by the turn of the century. Many were people from the rural South, most notably in Cambridge's case, they came from specifically the Tidewater area of Virginia. The other half of the black population came from the West Indies, like Barbados, and Jamaica, and Trinidad. And really surprising, I've read that some of them actually settled in Nova Scotia first and then came to Cambridge. Many of the first black residents to come to Cambridge worked in the service industry, which mostly employed Irish and other European immigrants in the previous generation. Around 1910, many people came to Cambridge from Barbados and Jamaica, fleeing colonialism in their home islands. The Boston area in general is heavily populated with former West Indians. Speaking about Cambridge's black population brings us to the first neighborhood we're going to cover, called the Coast, otherwise known as Riverside, just to confuse you and you can't locate the coast on a map. The Coast is one of the most legendary black neighborhoods in Cambridge and is also home to rapper Millie's. Millie's is the most well-known and successful rapper in Massachusetts at this point, and he's had an incredible 2024, and his star just keeps seeming to get brighter and brighter. For a lot of reasons, many people hate on Millie's, most obviously because he's white and from Cambridge, not Boston, but you can't deny the man's talent or his success. People can continue to hate, but honestly, Millie's is the only reason that anyone outside of Massachusetts has ever heard of Cambridge besides Harvard or MIT. He also does a lot to put less known Massachusetts artists on the map and really the whole music scene in the Bay State. It makes a lot of people unhappy, but Millie's is the gatekeeper for the New England rap scene right now, and it's really not up for debate. You can't make a video about Cambridge without talking about Millie's. You really can't. I'm not a Millie super fan. I'm not a hater at all either. He's a very talented rapper, and he's the most successful guy in Massachusetts and really all of New England right now. So, I mean, I've personally talked to him. I think he's a pretty decent guy. He does a lot for Massachusetts, New England artists. He brings a lot of attention to the region, and there was a lot of hate that came out after the Tommy G video, which I understand where a lot of the guys from Boston, what their point of view was about the stuff, but it's just like, at least there's attention being brought to the area, and like you really can't get mad at like Tommy G. He's a 20 something year old dude from Milwaukee, like Wisconsin. He doesn't know how the streets in Boston. He doesn't know what hoods to show and stuff like that. So, and you can't get mad at Millie's for like showing Cambridge where he's from. But I understand. Like I said, I'm not a hater. I'm not a super fan. I always try to stay in the middle, like as a reasonable thinker. The Coast is a wedge-shaped neighborhood bordered by Mass Ave and River Street. Western Ave goes through the heart of the neighborhood and is the oldest part of the area. In the early 1900s, the Charles River Dam was built, controlling the ebb and flow of the river, and a large marsh in the coast area was filled and settled on. Many of the houses built in the neighborhood in the early 1900s have these weird little box-like structures protruding from them. These were used as little storefronts that sold vegetables, dairy products, and meat. They served as early corner stores. Up until around 1950, there was also a cluster of commercial storefronts at the intersection of Howard and Western Ave, but Central Square became the place where the majority of the neighborhood got their everyday items. By the 1900s, the coast was mostly Irish and Greek, but even then had a sizable black population. This community was centered around the Western Ave and Howard Street area, and it became one of the city's first black middle-class neighborhoods, with the majority of the families owning single-family houses. Much later, there was the Putnam Gardens, a public housing project that was built in the coast. The cornerstone of the black community in the coast was centered around the Baptist Church on Western Ave, which was built in 1916. Cambridge's NAACP office happened to be on Western Ave as well. The coast was also home to NBA great Patrick Ewing. Patrick Ewing was born in Jamaica but grew up in Cambridge's coast neighborhood. Ewing became part of the city's amazing basketball legacy. This, I think, is another point of contention between Cambridge and Boston in the super competitive sports world of Massachusetts. The much smaller Cambridge boasts of having one of, if not the best basketball programs historically in the Commonwealth. The CLRS, or Cambridge Latin and Ring School, has one of the most legendary basketball teams in Massachusetts. In 1910, Cambridge's Latin and English high schools became one after the English building was demolished. Then in 1977, the Ring Technical School, named after Frederick Ring in 1933, combined with Cambridge Latin to become Cambridge Latin and Ring School. A single high school in a city of over 100,000 people is quite a rare thing in the Bay State, and probably contributed to them having such a good program for decades upon decades. In 1973, the team won the Eastern Massachusetts Championship and were Division II champs. Then in 1978, Coach Mike Jarvis, along with their star player Patrick Ewing, went on an unprecedented run in Massachusetts high school ball. Jarvis, who was a former player of CLRS coaching great Ed Culhane, along with Ewing, won 77 out of 78 games, the only loss being in an out-of-state competition. Ewing won 3 straight titles in his 4-year high school career, only losing his freshman year. Ewing grew up on River Street in the coast neighborhood and, like many inner-city Cambridge youths, saw basketball as a way to stay out of the streets. There were legendary outdoor courts that boasted some of the best pickup games in the Commonwealth, like Hoyt Field and Corporal Burns. It was said that Celtics legends like Bill Russell, Sam, and Casey Jones would come to pickup games at the Cambridge Community Center to scout talent and just play with these young guys because it was so competitive. Many early Cambridge balling legends credit coach Francis Jefferson for installing in them the fundamentals of the game. In 1986, a team led by Rumeal Robinson won the state title, and in 1990, a team led by Omo Moses did the same. In 2016, a CLRS team would go on another legendary run, winning 53 games in a row and 2 state championships in a run that lasted until 2018, showing that for over 50 years, Cambridge has been a dominant force in the Massachusetts basketball world. CLRS itself is one of the oldest institutions of learning in the United States, and in 1998 they celebrated the 350th anniversary. Although it hasn't been continually open as one school for that long, the idea of public schools and the necessity for education has existed in Cambridge since then and has shaped the institution in our entire country. Shout out to Cambridge Latin and Ring School. Round of applause. The next neighborhood we're going to take a look at is North Cambridge. North Side is the least densely populated neighborhood in the city, but the biggest land-wise, and it's bordered by Belmont, Arlington, and Somerville. The neighborhood mostly was first settled and built up by Irish settlers in the 1840s. They worked in large cattle yards. Many of these workers herded cattle coming off the Fitchburg rail cars and shuffled them through the Walden Street Cattle Pass Tunnel en route to the Cambridge Cattle Market. Many of the Irish also worked in giant brickyards that populated North Cambridge. The brickyards began to spring up everywhere because of the neighborhood's rich clay deposits. Besides the Irish, many French Canadians also came to North Cambridge to work in the brickyards and sand clay pits. Generation after generation of French and Irish grew up working in these brickyards, including legendary Massachusetts Congressman Thomas Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. O'Neill grew up in Dublin, the Irish neighborhood of North Cambridge, a few blocks away from Little France, the French Canadian stronghold. This was home to Francis Xavier Massey, famous hardware store owner FX Massey Hardware that closed in 2013 after 125 years of operation. Porter Square is the main commercial area in North Cambridge and is one of the city's 5 major squares, including Central Square, Harvard Square, Inman Square, and Kendall Square. This is also in very close proximity to Somerville's legendary Davis Square. Unlike the Port neighborhood, many guys from North Cambridge are cool as Somerville. Fast Coop, who's a rapper from North Cambridge with street affiliations, told me he's cool with a lot of dudes from Somerville, so it's not a citywide thing, it's really just the Port and MP45. If you've never heard of Fast Coop, go check him out. He's a talented rapper and an entrepreneur. My ex used to go to Lesley University and had classes near Porter Square, so I spent a lot of time in that area. There's lots of good restaurants and bars and just a lot of activity. She used to park at the Alewife station and take the red line into Porter Square. Now, from the Alewife parking lot, you can see these massive high-rise buildings. Those are known as the Ringe Towers. I've heard that Ringe has beef with Jefferson Park, another project on the north side, so I guess some of these north side hoods have beef with one another. This has been a hot spot for crime and street activity on the north side of Cambridge for a while. Out of the neighborhood's 11,000 residents, many of the newer ones are immigrants. Haitians are a large ethnic group in the city of Cambridge, and when they first began to arrive in the 1970s, many went to the old French church Our Lady of Piety that was home to the large French Canadian population in North Cambridge. Speaking Creole made it easier to communicate with the French speaking parish. The church has unfortunately since closed. Mass Ave is the main thoroughfare of the north side, running all the way from Porter Square up to the Arlington border. Next, we're going to discuss, in my opinion, the most unique and misunderstood neighborhood in the city, East Cambridge. This neighborhood, in my opinion, really isn't like any other neighborhood in the city. Well, let me correct myself. There's plenty of other tough white neighborhoods in Cambridge, but none that held on to the unique identity as long as East Cambridge did, which was well into the 2000s. East Cambridge is a tough white working class Boston area neighborhood that's often left out of the conversation. Charlestown, Southie, the North End, Eastie, Dorchester, Winter Hill, and Somerville were neighborhoods synonymous with tough hoods of Irish, Italian, Greek, and Eastern European descent, places where legendary bank robbers, dealers, and gangsters also came from. East Cambridge is very similar. Along with Irish, Italian, Greek, and Eastern Europeans that lived throughout the Boston area, East Cambridge also had its share of Portuguese hoodlums as well. East Cambridge is incredibly similar to these other legendary quote-unquote white Boston ghettos, but for some odd reason it doesn't get the same attention. Here's a fun fact that you might not have known. The legendary New York gangster Tommy D. Simone, played by Joe Pesci in the classic Martin Scorsese movie Goodfellas, was born in Cambridge, Mass. And moved to New York as a kid. Before we dive into the street legends of East Cambridge, let's discuss the tough blue-collar neighborhood's history first. East Cambridge was connected to Boston by the Canal Bridge in 1809 and helped the population of the neighborhood grow exponentially. By the mid 1800s, the main industry of the neighborhood was glassmaking. Later on in the 1800s, this would be surpassed by woodworking shops, metal making factories, and meatpacking plants. Many of the cattle brought in by Fitchburg rail cars to North Cambridge cattle yards ended up at the John P. Squire Slaughterhouse in East Cambridge, which became the neighborhood's largest employer by 1880. Thousands of Irish immigrants flooded East Cambridge to work at the slaughterhouse, also in furniture-making factories along with coffin manufacturers. By the end of the 1800s, many Italians, Poles, Greeks, and Portuguese followed the wave of Irish. At this point during the early 1900s, 80% of East Cambridge's families had two foreign-born parents. Many companies offered English classes at noontime during lunch break to help foreign-born workers assimilate. Then in the 1920s, many Russian Jews, Lithuanians, Albanians, Syrians, and Armenians came to East Cambridge. Many of these Eastern and Southern Europeans and Middle Easterners had already settled in the West End or some other bad Boston tenement neighborhood. Many of them brought along what was deemed to be an undesirable element. I couldn't find much about Prohibition-era crime in Cambridge, but I'm sure whatever was in Boston was also prevalent here. Throughout the 1900s, East Cambridge became a tough working to lower class neighborhood. Many of the neighborhoods were filled with either run-down two-story buildings, triple-deckers, or dingy-looking factories. Right after World War II, like many other large U.S. cities, Cambridge began to build many big public housing developments. There were projects built all over the city, many which still stand to this day, but in East Cambridge they built the Roosevelt Towers. Going past Inman Square on Cambridge Street, bordered on one side by Willow Street and on the other side by Windsor Street, and on the back facing a dingy old factory building, there stood 5 squat 3-story brick buildings surrounded by an 8-story quote-unquote tower. It was built in 1950 and like a lot of the U.S. projects was supposed to originally house U.S. veterans and their young families. Roosevelt Towers began to deteriorate throughout the 1960s, similar to the rest of the neighborhood. By 1970, the large deserted courtyard was home to 2 mangled basketball hoops, a handful of backless benches. The hallway of the tower reeked of urine. There was holes in some of the unit's doors. All the mailboxes had been ripped off the wall, and there was graffiti everywhere. While it was like this in the tower, the 5 3-story buildings were having a little graffiti on the outside were much nicer inside. Now, why was this? One of the reasons was many of the newer residents had the highest turnover lived in the tower, and they happened to be unfortunately mostly black people from Boston or elsewhere, not usually from Cambridge itself. The deplorable conditions in the tower included plywood-covered windows to try to hide burnt-out apartments and keep vagrants from squatting there. Many of the city's leaders blamed people from other parts of Cambridge for going to Roosevelt and causing problems. One of the most notable reasons attracting a bad element was the number of units in the tower apparently dealing H. A resident who didn't want to reveal themselves to the Harvard Crimson reporter who wrote this particular article said there was at least 5 families in the tower selling brown. Unfortunately, the families accused this were black families that had moved there from Boston. This brought about an element of racial tension in Roosevelt and East Cambridge as a whole. Like many of the tough, poor white neighborhoods in the Boston area, East Cambridge was very segregated, certainly compared to the rest of the city, and integration didn't always go smoothly. One way or another, the demographics of the Roosevelt Towers began to change dramatically from the very beginning, when it housed primarily young veterans plus their wife and kids, to being over 80% broken families, almost always missing the father. This is one of the main issues with the whole idea or concept of the projects of public housing in America: the displacement of intact families. Many times, if a family has a father living with them, they lose their benefits, encouraging the model for a broken family. It was completely counterproductive. Many people have heard of the Vietnam War protests at Harvard, one that turned into a minor riot. But beyond the social rebellion of some rich kids and pacifists, Cambridge is home to another less known riot that took place in the Roosevelt Towers. In reality, there were several riots and protests in the early 70s over a variety of issues pertaining to the quality of life in that particular project. On October 21st, 1972, four teenagers were stopped by police on Windsor Street. The police and the youths, both white and black, of East Cambridge had a terrible relationship. It was a well-known fact that if the cops caught you walking around the streets near the projects after dark, they were going to throw you a beating. Apparently, right before the cops stopped the group on Windsor Street, they found a storefront on Cambridge Street with a broken window. The police targeted 17-year-old Larry Largy and tried to arrest him for breaking the window. He kept insisting he didn't do it, or anything wrong for that matter. He begged the cops to let him go home, and even offering to pay for the window even though he didn't break it. A struggle began when they tried to arrest Largy. His friend 19-year-old Thomas Doyle came to his aid, trying to fight off the cops. More cops came, and as a crowd emerged, Largy and Doyle were dragged into a paddy wagon, followed by many officers, while the wagon rocked from side to side before it came to a standstill and then left for the police station. Around 3 a.m., Largy was found in cell number 9, unresponsive. He was then brought to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. Strange thing though is there was no one in the police records as being in cell number 9 that night. In fact, only Thomas Doherty had been processed at 11:40 p.m. There was no record of Larry Largy being in the police station or ever being arrested. This was a common practice according to the residents, and made it possible for cops to sweep their dirty deeds under the rugs. If it hadn't been for Largy's untimely death, this probably would have never come to light. The residents of Roosevelt Towers in East Cambridge were livid and demanded action. No police were ever charged in his death, though. Teens hit the streets looking for answers and justice, and they got neither. Many of their parents worried for their safety and tried to keep them inside at night. By this time, there was about 25 to 30 vacant units in the projects, 20 in the tower alone, and the conditions were terrible there. Security guards and residents had a terrible rapport as well. Some guards heard a teenager and were giving time off, hoping to prevent a full-scale riot, but things kept escalating. 3 times in a period of 3 weeks, over 100 kids battled with bricks, pipes, and bottles on the project's property. Then it came out that the Cambridge Housing Authority had been giving $500,000 to fix the projects, $162,000 specifically for Roosevelt Towers, but the leaders chose instead to sit around and do nothing with the funds. When residents found this out, they went insane. Finally, on September 5th, 1973, a group of white kids battled a group of black kids on the project's courtyard. 6 kids went to the hospital while fires were put out all over the projects. The headlines in the newspapers read, "Roosevelt Towers burn while bureaucrats twirl their thumbs." This has been an issue in Cambridge for years: nonsense with the housing authority. Also, the city has historically shown preference to its institutions of higher learning, especially Harvard and MIT. The ever-expanding campuses and housing for students almost always seem to come to the detriment of the poorer aspects of the Cambridge community. Janet Rose, a prominent housing activist from the new town court projects in the port, fought hard for rent control in the 1970s. After winning victory against the city of Cambridge, they threatened to take away rent control in 1980 from the residents on a fixed income. A group of protesters led by Rose set up trash barrels in the middle of the street, blocking traffic in front of City Hall. They proceeded to light fires in the barrels and protest until City Council decided to leave rent control in place. I wish Gloucester would get some rent control. Seriously. Legendary City Councilwoman Sandra Graham in the 1970s crashed a Harvard commencement speech once to speak against the university's exploitation of Cambridge's lower classes for their benefit. Still to this day, Cambridge caters towards universities and wealthy, unfortunately. Now, I'd be remiss once again if I didn't take this moment to talk about Cambridge's other most prominent institution for higher learning, MIT. While I wish I could discuss the over 60 colleges and universities in the city, I don't have time simply, but MIT is different. In the 1800s, educators believed that you could not mix a scientific education with a practical one, but the founders envisioned a new education to unify mind and hand, theory, and practice into a coherent program of study within a single institution. In 1860, William Barton Roger, along with some allies, petitioned the U.S. legislature and was given a charter in 1861, but then the Civil War happened and everything was postponed until 1865. In 1863, the U.S. government passed the Moreland Grant Act, which funded schools for mechanical and agricultural studies. In the West, they built the Mass Agricultural College, and in the East, they built the Mass Institution for Technology. MIT became a forward-thinking, innovative school from the beginning, attracting some of the brightest minds in the world. Its first foreign students came as early as 1866, and by 1910, 1 in every 15 students was foreign. The Cambridge School for Manual Training that became Ringe Tech was said to be an early domestic breeding ground for the future MIT students. Ellen Swallow Rogers was an early female graduate from the class of 1870 who was a pioneer in public sanitation, and Robert Robinson Taylor was the first black architect in America. These are some early prominent MIT graduates, but honestly, more than anything else, Good Will Hunting would have never been discovered if he hadn't got that job as a janitor at MIT and solved that impossible math problem. We would have never known about him. Alrighty, back to the east side. Let's talk a little bit more about the East Cambridge streets before we move on to the final leg of this Cambridge tour. I want to take this time to shout out my friend and East Cambridge legend, Bobby Lucas, aka B. Luke from the Bounce Back podcast. I hit him up a little while ago about some legendary names from the East Cambridge streets. He put up a post on Facebook that got like over 100 replies, and that's where I got a lot of these pictures as well. Some names that rang bells on the East Cambridge streets were Kevin Cooney, George Frankos, Jimmy Tavinas or Jimmy T, Bubba Good, the Sullivans, the Riordans, the Baldessaros, Nicky Camarada, Greg Campbell, Michael McQueenie Sr., and Dookie Kenny. These two are names that some people might actually recognize outside of East Cambridge. They had been linked to the crime in which Lowell bookie Jackie McDermott got unalived in his house by the mental Billy Barnowski. I have also heard the names Paul Walker and Tommy Ryan before, possibly in connection to some bookmaking operations still controlled by the Winter Hill Gang back in the 1990s. Either way, the point is East Cambridge is very similar to neighboring places like Charlestown and Winter Hill, which made it very unique to the city of Cambridge. Unfortunately, like a lot of these other tough white Boston area neighborhoods, it was ravaged by OCs and later Brown in the early 2000s. All right, so the biggest shout out to Bobby Lucas, aka B Luke, Bounce Back Podcast. It was so cool of him to put that up on Facebook, and so many people responded. And that was really helpful. And he's just really one of like the best guys I've met through this YouTube process, like one of the realest dudes. I wish him the success. If you guys have not subscribed to his platform yet, I don't know what you're doing. It explains so much about the Massachusetts prison system. There's tons of guys on there that like really explain what it's like and from different parts of the Commonwealth and really New England. Now he's got people flying in from all over the country, and so he talks about their experiences. And he himself was a prisoner in Shirley. I don't know if he was in medium or max. I think he was in the max. But he also talks about his brother's situation, his brother Jojo, who's doing a life sentence for a crime he didn't commit. Basically, he wouldn't cooperate with the authorities and rat on somebody, and they know he didn't do it, but he wouldn't cooperate, so they put him in the place of the person that did it, and it's insane. So if you can support JoJo, go to Bobby, follow him on Instagram, Facebook, all this stuff. He's very active in social media, and definitely subscribe to his platform. He's like a great guy, and I love what he's doing, for real. Now it's time to speak on the topic that most of the people who are mostly interested in the street side of the story have been patiently waiting to hear about as we move to the Port neighborhood and its somewhat highly publicized beef with Somerville, primarily the Mystic Project's MP45 gang. This beef is pretty well known on the streets of the Boston area and has been described in a drill rap beef over the past few years. The main beef is between the Port, primarily the projects in Newtown Court and Washington Elms, versus the Mystic Project's MP45. The Port, which was formerly known as Area 4, that's where the 4-4 comes from. Now, the original black neighborhood in Cambridge was in the Lower Port neighborhood. Over the years, the Port, along with the coast and parts of North Cambridge, have become the heart of the city's black community. In 1938, the city of Cambridge razed an entire tenement neighborhood, a common occurrence throughout the Boston area for the construction of public housing projects. Built in its place were the city's first housing developments, Newtown Court and Washington Elms. These early projects were smaller buildings clustered together, not giant towers. They originally were built to be segregated, a fact that my buddy from the Port Projects was surprised to find out when I told him. Originally, Newtown Court was meant to house white residents, and Washington Elms was for the black residents. This was the formula for the first few decades, but soon over time, the majority of both projects would house black residents. In the 1960s and 70s, Puerto Ricans began to settle on Columbia Street. Many Puerto Ricans moved east from the Connecticut River Valley into the south end of Boston and Jamaica Plain, and also ventured over the Port neighborhood as well. Many Dominicans also came during the 1980s, a lot of them ending up in the Columbia Terrace apartment complex. I read that a group called the Cambridge Alliance of Spanish Tenants bought the building for the many newly arrived Dominican immigrants. Throughout the 1980s, Columbia Street became one of the city's biggest Blanco copping spots. Many legendary Puerto Rican and Dominican traffickers and dealers plied their trade around this neighborhood. Columbia Street became synonymous with Latinos, mostly Puerto Ricans, pushing white in the late 1980s and 90s. Although he's from the coast, Millies talks about chilling in Columbia Park, slanging hard and soft. This is where he got involved in street stuff and started chilling with an older, more established gangster, an older black dude from Mississippi who was on the run, and I guess he was in fact featured on America's Most Wanted. Millies chilled in Columbia Park and slung out of there, even though he was from the coast. You can still see Sped tagged all over Columbia Street. Columbia Street still has a little bit of flavor, but like most of Cambridge, it's becoming gentrified very fast. I took a little video in the park last fall. Millies has progressively chilled more in the port and with port dudes over his career, even though he's from the coast. The majority of dudes in his circle are coast guys, including his manager C's, which congratulations, just won Manager of the Year at the Boston Music Awards the other day. They wear CMB chains with their sped chains, which I guess is a variation of the old school coast mob. By 1990, the port was the most diverse neighborhood in the entire city of Cambridge. Even through the early 2000s, many newly arrived immigrants settled in the port, mostly from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Albania, Kosovo, Laos, Vietnam, Brazil, Colombia, and Haiti. Some of the first generation Haitian kids caused the biggest problems in the port neighborhood and beyond in the early 2000s. Haitians have become one of the biggest immigrant groups in Massachusetts since first fleeing their troubled Caribbean island home in the 1970s. Massachusetts is only behind Florida and New York for the highest concentration of Haitians in America. Besides Brockton and the Boston neighborhoods of Mattapan and Hyde Park, cities north of Boston like Cambridge, Somerville, Medford, Malden, and Everett all have sizable Haitian populations, and all these cities neighbor one another as well. Apparently, a certain segment of teens of the Haitian descent from Cambridge were menaces in the early 2000s. I believe there was a group called H Unit. Security guards used to joke with the next generation, saying they were nothing compared to these guys. Apparently, an old legend goes that some Haitian kids from Cambridge got into it with some Haitian kids from Somerville at a basketball game sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. Oh, I don't know how true this is, or if it's just one of those urban legends that's been passed down over time. I know that there's some sort of hostility between these two hoods and has been for a while. I've also heard of a dude called Snow from the port from an earlier generation that used to terrorize Somerville guys. But the most recent and widely known beef from this current generation began from a crime that took place in 2017. A man who was living in Everett but was from the port took the life of a young Somerville man. Tony Deshaun Harris, aka Money, is alleged to have unalived Kevin Raymond, aka K Black, a 20-year-old Somerville resident. From what the authorities allege, the older Harris, who had recently wrapped up a sizable prison sentence for a prior assault with a dangerous weapon with intent to unalive. Being out for a short time, Harris is said to have been stuck in the prison and criminal mentality and was looking for an easy way to make money. Apparently, street chatter got to him that a younger kid was pushing good amounts of bud and seemed like a lick or an easy score. The 20-year-old Kevin Raymond, aka K Black, was selling bud, but from what I'm told, he wasn't a gang member. In fact, he was a college student and was just doing this to help support himself. So apparently it wasn't a hit or anything like that. It was more like a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't Money's intent to unalive Harris. Most people think that K Money resisted and fought back, and that's why it ended this way. Just because Money was from the port, it wasn't a gang thing. It wasn't sanctioned. The dudes from the port didn't know there was even a problem with the Ville until a few months later at an IHOP near Harvard Square, a group of port kids got blasted by an MP4 Vibe member, one person getting hit. Some of the guys, or one of the guys that were victims in the IHOP incident, got revenge against the people they believed were responsible, resulting in a young man being confined to a wheelchair. Numerous incidents involving weapons have been attributed to this feud. One infamous incident that the papers covered was about a moving firefight in the middle of the day between two vehicles on a Winter Hill street in Somerville. It was pretty interesting for me to find out that a lot of these guys knew each other from years back. Apparently, around 2010, 2011, Cambridge didn't have enough kids to field their own A team for youth football, the age group of 12 to 14-year-olds, the last year of Pop Warner, so they joined up with Somerville. So a lot of these Cambridge guys that were involved knew the deceased Cable Act from the A team years before the crime. They also played with Somerville MP45 rapper P-Bug, who was one of the top drill rappers from Somerville who disses the Port guys. One of the main guys the Somerville rappers diss is a guy named Bobby. Bobby's real name is Robert Favreau, a 22-year-old Cambridge man who was unalived in Somerville in 2021. From what I'm told, Bobby's death had nothing to do with the feud between the Port 44 and MP45, though. He had some sort of altercation, either from a dude that he was renting a room from or a friend he had been staying with. I can't 100% tell, but it was not street related. But that hasn't stopped some of the Somerville rappers from mocking his passing mercilessly in their songs. For the most part, this beef seems to have kind of sizzled out in the past few years, and from what I hear, it really hasn't carried on into the jails. It's mostly just a street thing. Rappers like the Port's G Nipsey, as they get more recognition in the rap scene, distance themselves from the street stuff. It's a very good choice, in my opinion. I'm a fan of G Nipsey, and I hope to see him succeed. Cambridge, of course, would love to see this beef over and done with, and for the public to quickly forget about it. An active gang feud on the streets with violence in broad daylight is not good for attracting rich new residents or college students, and it goes against the narrative that the city and the universities want to tell. Especially when MIT is right next to what was the hood in the Port. Just because the beef between the Port and MP45 is the most well known, it's not the only feud that the Port is involved in. Port neighborhood also has beef with the north side of Cambridge. Apparently, the beef goes way back decades. The dude I talked to said he wasn't 100% sure, but it could have been over something as trivial as a girl back in the day. He said he played football and they practiced on the north side of Cambridge, and he and his Port friends would have to walk and take the T back to the Port, ducking smoke the whole time. Not only is there this old simmering beef between the Port and the north side over a girl, but in the more recent generation, North Cambridge had an alliance with Somerville, more specifically MP45. Somerville split into two different sides, Eastville and MP45. North Cambridge's code is 5-4, so North Side and the Mystic Project guys used to say 5-4-4-5, like they were linked up. So with the North Side guys aligning with the Mystic Project, just kind of intensified the beef between the Port and North Cambridge that much more. Apparently, back in the day, there was also an internal beef in the Port neighborhood as well. Around 10 years ago or so, a dude from the Port named Ken stole a chain off another dude from the Port. He then went on to rock it in a rap video, adding insult to injury to the man he took it from. A short time after this, on July 4th, Ken's was unalived in a revenge crime by another Port man. This split the Port neighborhood into two. You had to pick one side or the other. It was either EJ or Ken's or Ben's block. Apparently, the chain that started the whole thing wasn't even real. People dying over fake jewelry, man. The Port, still besides parts of North Cambridge and a few little pockets of the coast, is the most active part of Cambridge to this day. But like I said, Cambridge city officials, along with leaders of over 60 colleges and universities, don't want you to know any of this. They especially don't want it in the headlines of newspapers or on the TV for it to be public knowledge at all. As it stands today, Cambridge is Massachusetts' fourth largest city with 119,000 residents. It's an incredibly diverse place. 50% of the population is white, 20% is Asian, a very high percentage for anywhere else in the Commonwealth besides Lowell. 11% is black, 10% is Latino, 2% Pacific Islander, and 6% is mixed of two races or more. Since the 2000s, many new ethnic groups have come into the city from Brazil, Central American countries like El Salvador. Of course, Haitians continue to come to Cambridge. There's been like 3 generations now of Haitian immigrants. Southeast Asian countries like Laos and Vietnam, even recent refugees from Eastern Europe. Many West Africans have come to the city as well, and the East African country of Ethiopia has the highest concentration of expatriates living in Cambridge than any other city in America. Cambridge has become a place that's very accommodating to foreign-born people, most likely because the city has been used to seeing foreigners come to their colleges and universities for hundreds of years now. This has led to Cambridge being an incredibly interesting and diverse place, and it's translated into the city's culture and certainly the food scene. You can find basically any type of ethnic food in the city. It's incredible. So ultimately, Cambridge is a much nicer and safer city than it was in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, heck, even just back in the 20 teens. It's partly because of the agenda of city leaders and university presidents and chancellors. A lot of it also has to do with gentrification. Many of the old projects and bad neighborhoods have been torn down or revamped. And with soaring rent prices, not many people continue to afford living in the city anymore. It's pretty clear that just like Boston, Cambridge is trying to attract yuppies, students, and the very wealthy, and it seems to be working. The coast, the port, north side, even the tough white neighborhood of East Cambridge is not immune to it. Cambridge, Massachusetts is and always will be America's original university city and America's mecca for higher learning. But like every big city, there's two sides to the story, and I hope that now you know the underworld and the history just a little bit better after watching this video. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was awesome for me to make. I learned so much. Big shout out to B. Luke, who's so helpful. Big shout out to a friend that helped me with some stuff. He'd rather remain anonymous, which many people who help me out with my videos choose that, which I always respect. This is one of those videos that's like I tried to trim it down, but there was just so much stuff. I just felt like I couldn't leave it out because it's so important to the story of Cambridge. I've wanted to do this video for a long time. It's one of the ones that hopefully I'll be able to export it. It's going to be such a big file. It's going to be a pain in the butt to upload it, but I hope you guys learned something. You were entertained. Big shout out to Cambridge. All the hoods. I only covered like certain neighborhoods in Cambridge. There's more neighborhoods than ones I just talked about. But what an awesome city, guys. I'm actually going there tomorrow. Most importantly, though, guys, you know the spiel. Make good choices, make good decisions, because that's all we have in life is our choices and decisions. Take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day. I'll talk to you guys real soon. God bless.